My name is Monica Hale. I'm 38 years old and 10 years ago my sister ran off with my husband, leaving behind her sick, gasping child in my arms. Break time equals 2/. If betrayal has ever silenced you, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more. The night they disappeared, the rain had been cruel, tapping on the windows like laughter. Sharon's perfume still lingered in the hall, the same one she wore when she hugged me goodbye, whispering, "You've always been stronger, Monica. You'll know what to do." Then she was gone. So was Keith. They left behind Ethan, her 6-year-old boy, pale, barely breathing, his lungs fighting like paper in the wind. The hospital said he might not make it through the week. Sharon didn't answer my calls. Keith didn't even check in. My parents were divided. Mom said, "Sharon just needs time." Dad said, "Keith always looked at her wrong." But no one came to help. No one except me and Ethan's little chest rising and falling through the nights. I worked double shifts at a diner, barely sleeping, feeding him soup, reading bedtime stories through my tears. I wasn't his mother, but I became one the moment they drove away. When the doctor said he'd live, I cried harder than I had when Keith left. Because survival was never the plan they believed in. But I did. And then 10 years later, they came back. Laughing. Married. Successful. Acting like Ethan never existed. Mom invited them over for dinner without telling me. The boy they'd abandoned was now a man. And he had questions I'd never been brave enough to ask. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner would be their undoing. Break time equals 2/. "He's your sister's son, Monica," Mom whispered. "Don't start trouble tonight." Trouble? I thought. They brought it years ago. I smiled. Because the real dinner hadn't even begun. I held Ethan when his chest shuddered and the nurses adjusted tubes like they tuned an instrument. I learned to read the tiny changes in his face before anyone could. I learned to feed hope into small things. A bowl of warm soup, the way a story could change a machine's beeping into breath. When Sharon and Keith walked away, they left the boy's world in my hands. They left a hole sewn with promises they never intended to keep. 10 years stretched and knitted at the same time. I worked nights. I learned insurance codes so I could argue with clerks. I learned which grants had strings you could cut and which had nets you could trust. I learned how to be a steady adult when the people who should have carried that weight traded it for glam photos and invitation lists. My parents, Margaret and Tom, took sides in the first days. Margaret folded towels and whispered that Sharon was finding herself. Tom pretended not to notice the missed court dates. Both loved appearances more than answers. Aunt Liza, my mother's sister, was different. She lived modestly, taught in a local elementary school, and kept a box of pencil-smudged IOUs in her dresser. She visited Ethan and me, bringing canned peaches and the kind of staff room honesty that cuts through evasion. She was my witness. She was the one who wrote down dates and names when the rest pretended nothing was wrong. "You keep receipts," she told me once. "Let the world learn what you already know." I kept the receipts. So when they returned 10 years later, hair sleek, children in arms, filming each other's veneer, I walked into their circle with a quiet I had practiced like a habit. At the barbecue they joked with neighbors. Keith mimed condolence and Sharon chirped a rehearsed laugh. At the mention of Ethan they called him dramatic and patted each other's backs. I watched my son, her son, sit on the porch, steady, his jaw set like iron beneath a shy smile. He had learned to hide a fury that looked in strangers' eyes like calm. When he stood and walked toward the table, taller and certain, the room's laughter folded for half a second. Then faces tilted, mouths opened, and the first gasp sounded like the start of thunder. Their faces went from amusement to a kind of shocked hurt that can't be faked. Ethan walked in with a slow confidence that did not belong to the boy we once cradled. He had broad shoulders now and a voice that carried in the yard without effort. He put down a paper bag as if it were a satchel of ordinary groceries. The bag held nothing ordinary. "You remember me?" he asked, and people shifted, awkward, guilty. Sharon's smile flickered as if a stage prop had been jostled. Keith's eyes went small. He fumbled for a joke that would smooth the weather. The guests looked at me, then back at the man who had been my child, and wondered why his presence had weight. Ethan's lungs had healed enough for him to breathe without the loud machine that used to govern our nights. But the scars were deeper than any scar they could see. He had learned to measure people by their willingness to stay, not by their speeches. He had learned bitterness the way some learn a language. Slowly, with grammar and pain. Yet on his face there was no show of rancor. He exhaled steadiness. He walked around the crowd and handed each guest a small envelope. People laughed at first, then frowned, then opened. Inside was a photograph of a hospital bed, grainy and raw, Ethan as a 6-year-old hooked to machines. Below the photo was a single line: "I survived while you applauded elsewhere." No accusations. No dramatics. Just a truth card set like a formal invitation. The laughter died. Whispered apologies ballooned into defensive explanations. Sharon's hand clamped over her mouth. Keith swallowed. My mother's face, always an expert at composure, crumpled like tissue in a storm. For the first time they could not reframe the scene with a caption and a grin. I stayed silent. Aunt Liza moved beside Ethan and gave him my hand a quick squeeze. She had always understood that small acts gather power. Ethan turned to me and offered a quiet smile. A small, private thing that said more than any sermon or speech would. In that hush he spoke to the room, not to punish but to reintroduce himself. I came to say thank you, he said. To Monica who stayed. To the people who left. Do you remember why? He let the question hang like a verdict that needed no sentence. They had been comfortable in their cruelty, until the person they mocked chose the moment to be whole. Those envelopes were only the start. I had kept a ledger through the years. Nights on call, receipts for oxygen canisters, bank transfers for co-pays, a list of nights I had sat awake measuring breaths. The ledger was not a ledger of resentment. It was a map of labor. It recorded my time, my money, the ways my life had been spent making survival possible for someone they thought would always be their accessory. When the barbecue cooled into strained conversation, I took the ledger out of my bag and set it on the picnic table. The page I opened to was a thin column of numbers and dates, each annotated with small notes. March, ear visit. April, respirator replacement. June, paid for school therapy. People shifted in their chairs. Keith lunged forward, trying to snatch it away. That's private, he barked. He never called it theft when he took things for granted, he called truth invasion. Private. I echoed. They left a child to my care and made his life someone else's punchline. Why is it private to know that? I spoke evenly because even anger must be given form. I read off a few entries. Nights when I had missed work, pay stubs used as proof, phone logs showing calls unanswered. I did not shout. I did not plead. I let the ledger do the speaking. Each name that looked away was recorded. Each spineless excuse fell like a tally. A neighbor, Mr. Albright, owner of the hardware store and a friend of my youth, stood and offered an affidavit. He had helped on days I fixed the porch roof, sliding me a ladder with a look that said, "We see you." He testified to the nights he had found me on the stoop with Ethan asleep on my shoulder. Aunt Liza handed a stack of postcards she had saved, notes from Sharon promising calls that never came. Publicness was not my goal, but accountability was. The ledger was a way to make memory traceable, unignorable. It made past invisible work visible. Some people left the table. Others sat like statues. My mother wept in a way that was more for herself than for anything else. Ethan watched faces bend under the clarity like a slow tide. He did not laugh. He did not gloat. He simply let the world make its own choice about who they were. And when the first person finally apologized, it was not a smooth act, but a sound laced with the shock of being seen. Apologies came like a trickle at first. Sharon's voice was thin. I was selfish, she said between forced breaths. Keith tried to dress his regret in explanations about temptation and weakness. My parents offered phrases that were polished for pity. We were misguided. We are sorry. But words were a currency cheapened by years of non-payment. I wanted action. I wanted change that made future harm harder and repair visible. So I set terms. Not financial extortion. Not a dramatic show. Terms that required work. I asked, nicely, precisely, that they contribute to a fund to cover the medical and educational needs that kept Ethan alive and thriving, that they sign therapist attendance notes, that Sharon and Keith attend family counseling, that my parents publicly acknowledge neglect in a written statement. I asked that they make restitution where records showed direct debts. I asked for presents, not promises. They balked. Keith argued. Sharon pouted. My mother pleaded for privacy. My father muttered about reputation. But Aunt Liza stood and said, "If you walked away, you owe a living." Her voice was small but steady. Influence runs on small truths. Negotiations stretched weeks. Pressures emerged in strange ways. Neighbors asking questions, old friends prodding at conscience. The ledger, however, did more than count. It shifted the moral calculus. To force the question, do you keep benefiting from an illusion or do you face the ledger and repair it? Eventually they signed on. The fund was established as a joint trust with outside oversight. Sharon, who had been the brightest at family gatherings, signed a document requiring regular check-ins. Keith agreed to volunteer hours and to take a paternity class that included accountability work. My parents issued a short statement about failing to show up and committed to public service in our town for a year. It was modest but real. The work was visible. It made complicity costly in ways that mattered to them. Public record, obligation, the slow grind of making amends. For Ethan, it meant resources that did not depend on my work alone. For me, it meant boundaries that had teeth. That night, Ethan hugged me. "You made them fix it," he whispered. I thought about how we had both built a refuge from rubble. It was not revenge in the old sense. It was the satisfaction of shape-shifting pain into a structure that would protect the next child. But people who are used to having the stage rarely give it up without a fight. Resistance came not from words but from small, spiteful acts. Sharon missed some of the scheduled sessions. Keith grumbled and delayed. My mother fell back into old habits, posting curated photos that hid real repair. There were petty sabotages. A cancelled donation, a late check, an invite withheld. Old patterns are stubborn because they are comfortable. They keep people in the roles they've rehearsed all their lives. One night someone slashed the tires of my car in the driveway. The police shrugged. Vandalism, likely dispute, they said. It felt trivial and existential at once. Whoever drove that blade wanted to make me feel unfixed. It was cowardly and clear. Ethan wasn't shaken. He'd learned to weather storms. He stood at my side and we filed the report together, an ordinary adult act in a life that had often required extraordinary measures. When the trust audits began, anomalies popped up. Small off-book transfers appeared in ledgers associated with investments my parents had boasted about. The trustee flagged them and requested explanations. Interpretations were given. Accountant errors, legacy payments, misfiled invoices. Some things could be explained. Some things couldn't. The trust's oversight had teeth. It also had bureaucracy which both stung and soothed. Reams of forms, required meetings, signatures from people who had never signed anything binding before. As the net tightened, allies surfaced. Neighbors who had once sat politely at barbecues now testified about missed promises. A former colleague of Keith stepped forward with copies of memos showing where funds had been misallocated under leadership my father once commanded. It was messy. It was legal. It was real. It forced the family into spaces they had avoided. Boardrooms, hearing rooms, mediator offices. Ethan, meanwhile, became public in a way that surprised us both. He began to speak at local meetings about access to care and about the arrogance of taking absence for granted. He no longer hid the young man he had been. People listened because his story was crystalline: ache, survival, and a refusal to be erased. All this did not come without cost. People I once called family threw temper tantrums and called lawyers. They accused me of exploiting privacy. They raised a million small rhetorical shields. But the trustee had documents. The press had receipts. The town had seen the envelopes and the photo that began the unmasking. They could refuse to change, but changing had become more expensive than confessing. The audits unearthed arrangements that embarrassed the family in a way money couldn't smooth. Contracts that had been signed in haste revealed favoritism toward certain advisors and a pattern of siphoning funds into opaque vehicles. The trustee moved to reclaim misallocated funds, and local authorities opened inquiries into governance failures. Invitations dried up. Foundation boards asked for new leadership. People who once sat at the head table found their chairs empty. Keith's company lost a big client. Sharon's new social projects found it harder to attract donors. My parents' name, once a comfortable headline, began to be footnote in reporting about accountability. The town newspaper published a feature on families and fiduciary responsibilities, quoting the trustees' findings in cautious language. For the first time, they could not turn PR spin into amnesia. There were legal letters, settlement talks, and a slow grinding removal of influence. None of this felt like joy. I did not exult in annoyance or ruin. I had never wanted them ruined. I had wanted them accountable. But consequence is consequence. People who had performed care were now measured by their performance in repair. Some, like Aunt Liza, said quietly, "I always wanted them to be my neighbors, not my rulers." Her wish felt modest and enormous at once. Ethan watched the fallout with a strange calm. He was not the kind of person who wanted an enemy list, he wanted ordinary things. A clean bill of health, a stable school, friends who stayed. People come undone quickly when their illusions are stripped. They try to bargain, to plead, to promise the moon. In the end, the paperwork did more than promises. It rearranged incentives and made neglect more expensive than presents. At the end there were concessions. A public apology from my parents that read like legal prose but still acknowledged absence. Sharon agreed to ongoing therapy and to regular reporting to the trust about her involvement in Ethan's life. Keith's role in local charities was paused pending oversight. The town would receive funds to support families in crisis. The ledger began to balance, not perfectly but in ways that kept the next child from being wholly at risk. Still, the last humiliation they could not wipe away was the look Ethan gave them across the room. The look of a man who had been left and had chosen to return on his own terms. That I kept one final small triumph for myself. On the day the trustees closed the major actions, I organized a quiet gathering in the old community hall. Not a celebration for drama, but a meeting for families who had been quietly carrying children like Ethan for decades. I invited folks who had helped. Nurses who stayed on overtime, teachers who let kids sleep on couches, neighbors who banked extra meals. I invited Aunt Liza, Mr. Albright, and the clinic staff. I invited Ethan, who stood by my side looking at a room full of ordinary heroes. My parents and Sharon and Keith declined. They had papers to sign and public statements to craft. They called with later apologies and offered late flowers. They sent messages heavy with performative regret. But the hall was warm and honest. We raised a fund that day and announced a small scholarship for medically fragile children in our town, funded by the trust and administered by an independent board. The thing I had wanted from the start, real help, not headlines, now existed. Ethan hugged me in the doorway as people filed out. He whispered, "You made a safe place." I heard his voice steady and real. "You didn't let me die twice," he added. That moment held a weight no gala could buy. If you've ever faced betrayal, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Have you ever forgiven someone who didn't deserve it? Tell me below. And subscribe for more true tales. I walked home that night with a strange lightness. I had turned anger into structure and abandonment into accountability. I had not sought to break them for the joy of breaking. I had made the architecture around future children sturdier so someone else's cruelty could not press them into silence. I had built institutions out of pain. Then I sent one last message to the family group chat. Short, factual, and final. The ledger is public. The trust is funded. We will not allow erasure again. I hit send and then blocked the thread. They would remember the night not for the embarrassment but for the moment their choices gained cost. They would have to answer to trustees and to neighbors and to the small, patient town that kept receipts. That was the sweetest justice. Not spectacle but structural change. I locked my door, breathed in, and let the night's quiet be not the absence of noise but the presence of rest. Their laughs turned into lessons.